Headlights cut through the snow like a question. For a long moment, Jackson Ryder could only watch the single pale shape on the shoulder of Route 47, a dark punctuation against the white field, and think that the world had lost its patience with him again. His truck's heater sighed, his breath fogged the glass, and somewhere behind the ache that lived in his ribs, he felt the old reflex tighten. If someone was out there in the cold, you stopped. He had learned to read the road the way other men read a ledger. Slippery meant slow, brake too hard and you'd spin. But a person standing alone in a storm was a different kind of hazard. It demanded more than caution. He killed the engine, pushed the truck into hazard, and felt the cold rush in when he opened the door like an answer to a question he hadn't meant to ask himself. Could he still be the kind of man who showed up? The figure moved as he climbed down, hands hugging themselves for warmth, shoulders drawn up under a coat that had seen better winters. Up close, Finn looked younger than his 21 years. Sharp cheekbones pinned with frost, hair knuckled with ice, eyes too wide and too tired to register surprise when Jackson knelt and offered his hand. "Hey," Jackson said. His voice was rough with cold and with something else. Years of saying the right thing at the wrong time. The word was a small knot of sound in the blizzard. "You don't want to be out here. Get in." Finn let himself be tugged up into the truck, the cold clinging to him like a memory. His jacket was thin. His laughter, when Jackson produced a spare blanket, was the kind of brittle sound that comes before the rain. When Finn spoke, his words were breath ghosts. "They said..." He stopped, pressed his hands to his mouth. "They just drove off." They drove to the farmhouse the way you drive when you have nothing else to do but hold on to the road. Jackson's truck cut an orange tunnel through the snow, and for a moment, the only light in the world was that thin line of pavement and the steam of a heater trying to make a home of a cab. He glanced at Finn in the glow, at the way his hands shook as he wrapped himself deeper in the blanket. The man didn't ask for explanation, didn't hurl accusations. He simply existed in that small, muttered way that made Jackson's chest ache and his instincts flare up in protective readiness. At the farmhouse, the lamps were already lit, the small glow a hearth against the dark. Jackson brought Finn inside, set him with a steaming mug and a blanket, and for a while they sat in companionable silence while the snow hammered the roof. The house breathed in the way houses do when someone has been gone long. The empty chair by the stove, a pair of boots that would never be filled again, a faint impression of two lives intersecting and then stopping. Daniel's boots were tucked under the bench, Daniel's coat still on a peg behind the door. Jackson's fingers ghosted over the fabric like a benediction. "Name?" "Jackson," asked finally, because asking someone's name was the only honest way to begin making them real to you. "Finn," he said. When he said it, the name sounded like a small, stubborn flame. Finn Holloway. Jackson felt the name like a stone thrown in a pond. Holloway. It handed him a map he did not want to read. He had seen that name in the town's margins, someone who kept themselves carefully out of sight. Men in the Holloway orbit were the kind of people you greeted politely from a distance and did not pry further. They had money and pride, and they carried their secrets like a second coat, necessary, heavy, and smelly with smoke. Finn's laugh was a sound that tried to be casual and failed. "Not like you think," he said. "My father. I mean, not my father, really. His family, it's complicated." Jackson waited. If there was one thing he'd learned in the years after Daniel died, it was that people tended to hand you the sharp edges of their truth when they had nowhere else to put them. He poured another mug, set it in front of Finn, and watched the steam curl up like a small promise. "They said I should leave," Finn said finally, in a voice flattened by the day's cold. "I thought it would be some kind of punishment from my own family or something. But," he swallowed, "he told me." And then, slow and raw as a winter wound, Finn spoke the line that would fold the night into a particular kind of darkness. "Tonight, Pretend you're not my lover." The words fell like glass. Jackson had the Christian cadence of someone who'd buried dreams and tried not to speak their names. He thought of Daniel standing at the barn door, the way Daniel used to hum when he thought no one was listening, the small domesticities that had made up their life. He thought of the way some wounds begin in the mouth of another person. Finn's eyes did not look away. They were not pleading. They were stating something that had happened and that existed now in the clearest of ways. "He said it out loud," Finn said. "He told his son, right in front of me. Said we couldn't be seen. Said it would ruin them. Then they drove me out to the turnoff and left me." There it was, clear and terrible in its simplicity. The order had been given, and someone had obeyed. The danger of it wasn't just the cold night. It was the removal of a person from the life of someone who could have sheltered him. Finn's story unfolded in small fragments. A lover who was from a family that mattered, a boss who kept appearances, a command barked for a reason of power and blood. There were no dramatic fights, no cinematic betrayals, just a dismissal that had the force of law behind it. Jackson's hand closed around his mug until his knuckles hurt. He felt the old grief wake like something with a pulse. Daniel's absence, a hollow that sounded differently now. It had been occupied by another's pain. He had promised himself many things in the years after, promises meant to keep him in low orbit, to mind the cows, to keep the barn standing, to not get tangled again. But a man in need in the snow was one of those moral experiments that didn't wait for a dissertation to be written. Jackson could have left him. He did not. Sheriff Miller's truck arrived with a chirp and a halo of red and blue that blurred the world. She was an anchor in a town that sometimes forgot the value of steady hands. The two of them had been colleagues once, then friends, then a kind of chosen kin. She moved through the farmhouse with the careful efficiency of someone who had learned to fold crisis into practicalities: coats, blankets, a promise of a warm place tonight. She sat at the kitchen table and listened like a person who believed the weight of being heard could be medicine. "You did the right thing bringing him here," she said to Jackson, not as a lecture, but as a confirmation. "Roads closed up towards town, no way through until morning. For now, he's safe." Finn's shoulders sagged with a sense of relief so complete it surprised him. He had been hollowed out by being told to disappear. To be given shelter in a house that smelled of wood smoke and old paint seemed almost indecent. He kept worrying he would be asked to leave at dawn, like a guest who had overstayed his welcome. When Jackson offered him the spare room, Daniel's room, Finn went there with the tentative reverence of someone stepping into a memory that wasn't his, but had become his shelter. "Do you want me to stay?" Jackson asked, more softly than he meant to. The question was practical and also foolishly human. It asked whether Finn wanted to accept being seen. Finn looked at him, and in the space between them, something shifted. He told Jackson about the fear that had been scored into him since the day the car stopped and the engine's warmth marched away. He told him that the man he'd loved was soft and uncertain and terrified of a father's power. He told him he had been told to be invisible for the sake of a family's name. He did not give names that mattered beyond his own. No glamour, no villainy in speech, only the simple cruelty of being made small. Jackson did not promise the world. He promised stew and a warm bed, and that he would not make Finn leave before he was ready. It was the smallest of promises and the most radical. If you read something in this moment that feels like an invitation, stay with it. Let the story unfold. There is much to come. In the days that followed, the snow sat like a white blanket over everything, muffling sound and slowing time into a pattern of small tasks. Jackson and Finn found a cautious rhythm. Jackson chopped wood and repaired a fence. Finn cleaned the studio and unearthed paints that had been untouched since Daniel's death. The studio was a small room at the back of the house, full of the smell of turpentine and the dust of unused canvases. Finn stood there, hands dark with color, and he looked like someone returning to a homeland. He painted in fits and starts at first, the way people always do when they're learning to trust but their hands will be kind to their memory. Jackson watched him, the way you watch a barn raise its roof, a slow accumulation of shelter. Finn painted skies that seemed to have pockets where light could hide. He painted hands that reached and did not tremble. He painted a horizon where two shapes met in the distance and didn't dissolve. Sheriff Miller handled the practical side of things with a patience that made Jackson both grateful and angry in equal measure. She filed the report, got Finn medical attention, and set the wheels in motion. It was not a clean process. The town had its own rules and its own blindness. People were careful with the Holloway name. Still, a report existed now, and a caseworker came with forms and a voice that said, "We'll look into the abandonment." Words like that never fully healed anything, but they changed the story from "it happened" to "someone knows it happened," and that mattered. There were small intimacies that knit them together. Breakfasts with their elbows on the table, their mugs marked by the thumbprints of use. Jackson teaching Finn how to gut and hang a deer without letting the violence of it bruise the reverence of survival. Finn teaching Jackson to loosen his hands with charcoal, to let the line be unforgiving and beautiful at once. At night, they shared the small domesticities Daniel had left behind. An old record that played quiet, a sweater that still held a scent of soap, and something sweeter. They did not rush the word love into those rooms. It would have felt too big for the first days. Finn's art became the thermometer of his recovery. Where the first attempts were skittish, later canvases held a firm, trembling confidence. He painted the road where he'd been left, and gave it a sentinel, an old mailbox with a lantern hung beside it. He painted hands offering bread. He painted a portrait that caught Jackson off guard, the man with his face lit by a fire, eyes set on a horizon not yet visible. It was not a flattering picture, it was an honest one, the way someone looks when they have stopped apologizing for occupying space. But healing lived alongside caution. A voicemail arrived one evening after they'd been home for a week, the tone clipped and careful. The voice informed Jackson that it would be best not to get involved. It mentioned reputation and consequences and offered thin, practiced concern for Finn's privacy. Jackson's jaw tightened. He felt the old deputy's blood rise behind his calm like a red flag in the wind. But Sheriff Miller advised slow, legal channels, filed a report, document the abandonment, do not engage in theatrics. The law could be a slow scythe. It could also be the one tool that kept them from making the wrong kind of bargain. There were other signs. A black SUV idled at the end of the lane one afternoon, and Jackson watched it through the binoculars until the driver realized the farmhouse was being observed and retreated. A man in a suit left a typed card at their door with a message that read more like a warning than a condolence. Finn could feel it like a vibration in his bones. He had learned to read their language, absence disguised as generosity, power leaning on the polite edge of coercion. It made him smaller, at least for the moments when memory was sharpest, the cold, the sense of being an accessory to someone's image rather than a person. Jackson was not a man of many words in the face of threats. He was a man of doing. He built locks into the barn, installed a lamp on the lane that took longer to warm than he had patience for, and called in favors from old colleagues who owed him more than they were willing to admit. But he also learned to stay a step back, to trust the law when it functioned, to let Sheriff Miller's practical steadiness serve as the fulcrum for their fight. Months do strange things to grief. Sometimes it stretches open like a valley. Sometimes it shrinks until you can't tell whether your ribs are empty because of the past or because the present is still making its demands. For Jackson, the months that followed Finn's arrival were a negotiation between the past and the present. He worked on the farm. He repaired fences. He let vegetables grow in a garden that had once been Daniel's project. He learned to tie Finn's scarf when the thread stubbornly refused to knot. He let himself be seen in the small ways: coffee cups left on the porch, early morning breakfasts where neither of them had to pretend the world was other than it was. There were reckonings that came from outside. The police investigation had enough to charge someone with endangerment. Holloway's son, Marcus, found himself in the uncomfortable light of legal consequences. It was quiet, not cinematic. There were statements, depositions given in a sterile room that smelled of lemon disinfectant, and a judge who pronounced things in a voice that meant to be just. Marcus's lawyer argued for discretion. Marcus argued, at first, for something like regret. The law asked for things the world had not asked for before: accountability in a language that could be documented. Jackson watched it all with the same measured attention he gave a sick animal: necessary care, edged with the knowledge that justice is not the same thing as repair. He did not expect a courtroom to put Finn back together. He did not expect a sentence to fix the nights when migraine storms would deluge Finn's sinuses. But the law's involvement made certain actions visible in a way that was useful. Someone had to be held responsible for leaving a person in a storm. Responsibility was not always retribution. Sometimes it was simply the world saying, "You did this, we will not let it pass." In the quiet that followed the legal motions, there were moments of fragility and ridiculous tenderness. Finn learned to cook stew the way Jackson did: lots of slow-simmered things and not too many spices. And he added a dab of something sweet that put them both off balance. They built a routine that made room for grief's return without letting it take up the whole house. There were nights when Finn woke with the old panic, and Jackson held him until the breath steadied. There were mornings when Jackson woke from a dream of Daniel's laugh and found Finn making toast. They made a map of their lives in the spaces between tasks: the studio for painting, the kitchen for mending, the porch for evenings when the world felt sufficiently tame to sip tea on. Finn's agency mattered in all of it. He never accepted help like a commodity handed to him. He worked for it. He chose it. He claimed it as something he had the right to receive. When the prosecutor asked Finn if he wanted to press charges, Finn considered. The man in the suit who'd left the card had been an emissary of the family that had discarded him. Pressing charges felt like ripping off a bandage, but it also felt like speaking his worth aloud. He chose to press for accountability, not out of vengeance, but because it gave a name to what had been done to him. He wanted a record that would make it harder for anyone else to be left on a road in a storm. Jackson supported him, not because he needed to be useful, but because he had learned in the slow, patient work of mourning what it meant to be present. He escorted Finn to hearings and sat with him in sterile rooms and handed him a cup of coffee when his hands trembled. There was no heroism in it. There was only the quiet insistence that two people could do the hard thing together and make a brittle world a little less so. They found allies in odd corners of town. Sheriff Miller came by with a loaf of bread and a pie she had purchased, with the same practical affection she used to fix a tire. Mrs. Keene from the feed store brought seeds and a skeptical smile. A neighbor offered an extra space heater, and at holiday time, someone donated a small fir tree that leaned politely in the corner of the living room. The town stitched itself into the life of the farmhouse the same way Finn's painting stitched color into the studio: small acts of attention that accumulate into something like repair. There were nights that tested them. A man in a suit slid into a booth across the road from the county courthouse and watched Finn with an interest that did not belong to a curious citizen. The SUV reappeared on the lane, but Jackson drove out there and stood like a boulder in the road until it retreated. Finn, when pushed, refused a dramatic response. He was not interested in escalating anything into more violence or spectacle. He wanted to live his life, to paint, and to make a home. The danger served as a bitter, adhesive reminder of the power that had been wielded against him, power disguised as family, as obligation, and how small, fragile selves sometimes had to learn to use the tools that kept them whole. That winter, on a day when the snow had softened to a film of gray rain and the edges of the world were blurred, Finn painted a portrait of Jackson. He worked in the early light. Palms dyed with ultramarine and sienna, and the painting took its own time to be made. It was not a flattering portrait of heroics. It was a faithful rendering of someone who had learned to be steady. In it, Jackson's face was lined with weather and thoughtfulness, and his eyes looked towards something that wasn't yet visible. Finn held the brush with the reverence of someone who knew how to make an offering. When he unveiled the painting in the studio, Jackson couldn't find the words. He had known, he had suspected, that Finn was talented, that his art might one day be noticed. But to see himself through another's eyes was an experience that slotted into the place where he had been hollow. Finn moved like a man revealing a small miracle and said, "You saved me, Jackson." He paused. Not like a rescue, like he searched for the language and found it. "You let me stay." Jackson felt something unwedge inside him. He remembered Daniel in the way you remember the color of a shirt after years of not wearing it. He remembered the quiet evening when Daniel had said, "We do our duty to the people who come to us." Daniel had not said it grandly. He said it while mending a fence, with a safety pin on his lip and a patience that was the kind of love that doesn't seek reward. Jackson had believed it then, in the commonplace way of shared lives. Now, with Finn and the studio and the painting, he believed it again. The case against Marcus Holloway found its way through the system, slow and legal, and not especially cinematic. The court required statements and testimony. There was no grand confessional in a warehouse, no last-minute violence, just depositions and the sober hum of bureaucracy doing the work of making consequences real. Marcus was charged with endangerment for his role in the abandonment. He hired a lawyer and argued that he had been coerced, that family pressures had forced his hand. The prosecutor's office pushed back on those claims with the stubborn competence of people who had chosen the law as their craft. No single victory unspools all the things that had been done. Finn's scars did not vanish with the gavel strop, but there was a kind of public naming that shifted the world enough to make it safer for someone else. There is a strange kind of justice in bureaucracy. It is never poetic, but it is persistent. Jackson watched the legal process like a man watching a tide tile itself, slow, inevitable, and not always clean. After the hearings, the world resumed its quieter rhythms. Finn enrolled in evening art classes at the community college and began, carefully, to show his work. Jackson went with him to the first small gallery opening where Finn's canvases hung like a bold weather in the room. People bought one or two pieces. A neighbor commissioned a small landscape for her kitchen. The studio hummed with new voices, with the kind of ordinary praise that becomes meaningful precisely because it lacks spectacle. Finn's smile in those evenings was an ordinary thing, an infrastructure of contentment rather than a flare of glory. As spring edged toward the farmhouse, the men undertook a ritual that opened itself like a wound and then sealed over with kindness. Remembering the place where Finn had been left, a battered mailbox at the turnoff where the road split from the county highway, they drove out in the light afternoon and set a small, weatherproof box on a stake by the lane. Inside, they placed a hand-knit scarf, a flyer with shelter numbers, a thermos, and a small card that read, simply, "If you need help, stop here." They nailed their donation to care into the landscape as if to say, "Someone saw you, and someone built this place for you." They bolted the box securely and set a painted sign beside it that Finn had made, bright blue with a lantern and the words "Warmth and Help" in careful, blocky letters. The act felt unbearably small and unbearably big. It was their way of converting the past into a tool for the future, a practical thing that said plainly, "We will not leave you." At night, the two men sat on the porch and shared a blanket and watched the stars in a sky that had nothing to do with the troubles of men. Finn's head rested on Jackson's shoulder, and the world was plausible again. It wasn't perfect. There would be bills and bad days and moments when grief rose like sour bread in the throat. But there was a sense now that the house could hold more than just memories. It could hold a life. On the day Finn received a small note from the art college, an invitation to a scholarship review, he sat in Daniel's studio and painted the horizon for the 100th time. He painted Jackson beside him, not as a savior, but as a companion in the long, unheroic work of living. When the painting was finished, he hung it in the entry hall where anyone who came to the farmhouse would see it. It was a portrait of quiet, mutual rescue. "Who did you think you were saving?" Jackson asked once after a long afternoon that had been heavy with chores and light with small jokes. Finn met him with a look that was steady. "You," he said simply, "and myself. We saved each other." Jackson wanted to argue that he had done the heavy lifting, that he had pulled Finn from the road and kept him warm. But the truth was knotted differently. Finn's presence yanked Jackson back into a world where he could love again, where hands that had been experienced in loss learned the shape of giving instead of merely maintaining. On the day Finn received a small note from the art college, an invitation to a scholarship review, he sat in Daniel's studio and painted the horizon for the 100th time. He painted Jackson beside him, not as a savior, but as a companion in the long, unheroic work of living. When the painting was finished, he hung it in the entry hall where anyone who came to the farmhouse would see it. It was a portrait of quiet, mutual rescue. "Who did you think you were saving?" Jackson asked once, after a long afternoon that had been heavy with chores and light with small jokes. Finn met him with a look that was steady. "You," he said simply, "and myself. We saved each other." Jackson wanted to argue that he had done the heavy lifting, that he had pulled Finn from the road and kept him warm. But the truth was knotted differently. Finn's presence yanked Jackson back into a world where he could love again, where hands that had been experienced in loss learned the shape of giving instead of merely maintaining. They had constructed a family out of two people who trusted one another enough to keep trying. There were moments of quiet justice, too. Marcus Holloway's charge resulted not in a headline that closed a chapter, but in a small, consequential ruling and a probationary sentence that included community service and mandatory counseling. The court required him to publicly acknowledge what he'd done and to participate in a restorative process that was, for Finn, less about punishment and more about making a record no one could easily purge. The Holloway family learned, in a limited public way, that being powerful doesn't make cruelty invisible. Power, it turned out, could be contained by the simple mechanisms of accountability, and those mechanisms were messy and human and slow. They were also necessary. Finn said nothing grand about it. He accepted it as proof that the world could be made to bend towards fairness if you had someone to trudge through the bureaucratic mire with you. On a late summer evening, the road that had once been the site of abandonment was soft with dust and light. Finn and Jackson drove out to the mailbox and found it untouched. The box they'd built had weathered the season and held its contents. A stranger had left an extra pair of socks. The world had not changed its shape, but the landscape had been altered by small acts of deliberate care. The final image of their season together was quiet and domestic and full of the kind of dignity that does not require applause. Finn's portrait of Jackson hung in the hall, and when people came to visit, they saw the man there in color and light. Jackson kept his old habits. He went out to check the fence at dawn. He repaired a barn hinge with the meticulous patience of someone who loved a building into usefulness. He learned to pour coffee without knocking over the sugar jar. He learned to let himself be loved in the small ways that hold a life steady. They both knew the future would not be tidy. There would be seasons when Finn's past would shadow him, and times when Jackson's grief would feel as large as a storm. But they had built a shelter that made room for those storms without being consumed by them. They had made a family, chosen and steady, and they had created a public, small and local, that would respond when someone was left at the roadside. If this story touched you, consider sharing it or supporting a local shelter. Sometimes the most powerful things we can do are small, practical, and immediate. The portrait on the studio wall held them both, a quiet testament to two lives that found their way back from being raw and wounded to being useful and kind. Finn painted the details no one had asked for, a scar that Jackson did not even remember showing, a freckle that caught the light, and in doing so, he gave him the gift of being seen. When winter eased into its next cycle, Jackson and Finn stood together at the porch and watched the road. It was a long road, and it had no illusions about the ease of human hearts. But it also held the mailbox and the box and the sign and the knowledge that when someone stood on the shoulder of it, somebody would stop. They had turned a command meant to disappear a person into a promise to appear for them. They did not need to say the words that had once been used to cast someone out. They only needed to hold the small truths they had cultivated, that no one should be left to freeze for the sake of a family's image, that art could be a kind of repair, that grief could be an opening if you let the light in, that love could be practical, patient, and sustaining. And sometimes, in the quiet between chores, Finn would sit at the studio window and murmur the line as if practicing it for the sake of the past, once and only once. "Tonight, pretend you're not my lover," he would whisper as a memory, and then he would fold it into the painting and move on. The painting of Jackson hung in the kitchen where it warmed the rooms like a fire. They ate stew and held the line of their lives steady, not because they'd won a battle in a movie, but because they had kept showing up. It was a quieter victory, small, hard-earned, and real. When visitors asked how they had gotten through it, through the abandonment, the legal frictions, the months of proving themselves a small, stubborn, targetable thing in the face of a name that had once tried to make Finn vanish, neither man offered a neat summation. They offered instead a list of small things: a warm bed, the smell of paint, a phone call that turned into a visit, a neighbor who brought extra wood. They spoke about the work of being human in the world, to keep somebody else safe because you can, to teach someone to paint, to hammer a stake into the ground and nail a box of kindness to it. It was not a grand finish. It didn't need to be. The last image we carry from their story is of two figures on a porch at dusk, one tucking his hand into the other's glove, both watching a road that now, finally, felt like a place where people might be met instead of being left.